Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Insightful Leader Live. I'm your host, Rob Mitchum, and with me today are Kellogg professors William Brady and Tessa Charlesworth to talk about how AI reflects human bias and what to do about it. Before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping updates. The Insightful Leader Live is brought to you by Kellogg Insight, which is the digital magazine for faculty research and ideas from the Kellogg School of Management. At insight.kellogg.northwestern.edu, you can find lots of stories, podcasts, webinars like this one on a broad range of topics in business and leadership, and especially recently, a lot of articles about artificial intelligence. That's the subject of today's webinar, which is our first of 2026. We are working hard to book out the rest of the year's programming, and I can announce that we have confirmed the next one. It will be on February 26th with Kellogg professor Lee Thompson, and the subject of that webinar will be, Can Business Negotiation Strategies Work with Friends and Family? So it should be a very interesting discussion. We encourage you to join us. Registration is not open for it yet, so we're working very hard to get that up. But if you subscribe to our newsletter, there should be a link in the chat right about now. You will be the first to hear when registration is open, and you can hear about all of our future Kellogg Insight events and hear about our stories as well. Speaking of the chats, we will be closing that in just a couple minutes to our viewers, and we ask if you have questions for our speakers today to please submit those via the Q&A button on the Zoom app. If you are interested in closed captioning, you can turn that on using the live transcript function in Zoom. And finally, we're recording today's session. We hope to have the link ready in just a couple days, and we will send it out to everybody who registered for today's event. Okay, with that, I will formally introduce our esteemed guests for today, starting with William Brady, who is Assistant Professor of Management and Organizations at Kellogg. His research examines the dynamics of emotion at the social network level and their consequences for group behavior. He combines tools of behavioral science and computational social science to develop person-centered and design-centered interventions that improve our digital social interactions. Thanks for joining us, William.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
And then over here is Tessa Charlesworth, as seen in the opinion section of the New York Times this week. Please do check out that article which ran yesterday. Tessa is also, excuse me, an assistant professor of management and organizations at Kellogg. Her research tackles the questions of how and why our thoughts, beliefs, feelings, and attitudes change over time. Her research adopts a multi-level and multi-method approach to understand change as it unfolds within individuals, organizations, and the broadest level of our collectives. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, to begin, can each of you say a little bit about how you come to study this topic of AI bias and how it connects to your research thus far in your career? Go ahead, William.
Yeah, so I actually got interested in this topic when I was in college. So I'm an elder millennial. And so that means that Facebook and social media was really just starting to come out. And we viewed it as a really good opportunity to have digital social connections, right? After a few years of using it, I started realizing that there were some big differences in how these digital social interactions go compared to how it is offline. And so I got very interested in the AI systems that were being developed at the time to facilitate the kind of social information that we were getting fed on these social media platforms. And so I've been studying the biases of these types of AI systems for over a decade now.
Great. And Tessa, you study bias.
That's
how
right.
did you come to AI models?
Yeah, so it was actually more as a methodological tool to expand the reach of my research. So I was kind of core social psychology, studying bias with our typical survey measures, and it just wasn't giving us enough traction on these big questions of how does this really, have these ramifications across history. And right at the time I was grappling with those questions, these large language models, these massive models trained on big language data, especially back in history, came online. And so I was able to, for the first time, start to ask these same kinds of questions of change and bias, now using AI tools, but back 200 years ago in books. And so, as Billy was also saying, it immediately started to reveal all these much more hidden patterns of biases that we social psychologists have typically not thought about. And so it became this additional toolkit that I could use that's now grown into a big part of my research.
Okay. Well, you bring up an important point, and I want to clarify this at the top of the hour, which is that the two of you are not like extreme AI skeptics. This is not going to be an hour about how you should never use AI tools, correct? How are you approaching this topic? Where are you coming from? What's your perspective?
Yeah, the way I see it is it's not about AI skepticism. It's about understanding AI better to make sure that you're getting the most of it when you do use it, especially as an individual or within your organization. I think to be aware of what it's good at, what it's not good at, and the biases surrounding it actually makes you a much more informed user.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I think it's much more about information. We want to give you, again, AI is a tool, and we would never expect you to go and just like pick up a hammer and use it for every task. We want you to know what is the best task and what are the limitations of that hammer as well.
Great. Well, let's start at the very basics, and it's a foundational question. What are we talking about when we talk about bias in AI models? I'll start with you, Glenn.
I'm going to let Tessa start.
Swing it back the other way.
Tessa is one of the leading experts in studying bias in general in AI models. So I'll let you start.
Yeah, and I would like to start just by defining bias more generally, because I think we need to get that on the table. So bias is basically this pattern of errors, right? And it can be an error pattern of deviations in at least two ways. One could be that it's a deviation from accuracy, right? We're saying the wrong thing. The AI model gives you an output and it's blatantly false. It says something like, women can't be computer programmers, something like that. But there's also a bias that is an error and a pattern of deviation from our values. So even if it is accurate, it says like women are unlikely to be computer programmers, that might still be a bias in the sense that it's a deviation from what we would want our society to look like. And so that is also, it is saying something about the normative value, the kind of like expectations that we have of our world. That is also a bias. And so anytime we interact with AI and it continues to give us these kinds of errors or these deviations from what we think is true or what we think is right, that's information for us.
And you talk about there's two different types of bias, or two categories, implicit and explicit bias. So maybe give us an example of those and how that might look in AI.
Definitely. So explicit bias are the super obvious forms of bias. These are obvious forms of discrimination, slurs that you might read on the internet, people responding to surveys where they would say things like, no, I explicitly dislike old people, or I explicitly dislike women. That's explicit bias. Implicit bias is much more hidden. It's kind of resting under the surface. It can come out more in patterns or these kinds of deviations that I was talking about. It can come out more in associations that you make between groups. So it might be just easier for you to pair things like old people and slow, or old people and cognitively disabled, those kinds of patterns of word associations or pattern of concept associations that you might not explicitly endorse or want, but just happen in your mind. Those are more those implicit biases. And now in my own research, as well as tons of other people, it seems that AI bias, although there are still some moments where it's really blatant and toxic, and I'm sure Billy can talk about some of those, most of what we see and most of what we're actually concerned about are these more hidden forms of biases that will still get under your skin and still inform your decisions, but you might not be able to flag them more easily.
I see, yes. And so, William, AI means a lot of different things currently. A lot of people are starting to typically mean large language models these days, chatbots, AI search, that sort of thing. But there's also generative images, there's recommendation systems, facial recognition. What are some of the ways that bias is manifesting in these different forms of AI?
Yeah, so I would contrast, for example, what Tessa was talking about, which is extremely important, these biases that are centered around how we think of, talk about social groups. And I think often when we talk about AI bias, we're typically referring to these kinds of terms for good reason. I would also encourage us to take a step back and think about bias as a much more general concept in AI systems. So basically all AI systems have something called an optimization function built into them. And really what that means is they have this goal to optimize a certain thing, right? So the systems need to learn, how do I get this desired end goal? And my general point would be that anytime you optimize for one specific thing, now the model becomes biased toward that, and other things fall to the wayside, other goals you might have. And so it's important to think about that for a few reasons. I think we're going to talk about them throughout this. But I'll just give one as a start. So imagine the types of AI systems that control the content we see when we log into social media feeds. So LinkedIn, TikTok, Facebook, whatever is your poison of choice. So these systems are typically optimized for engagement. So why is that a bias? Well, it turns out if you optimize the system for engagement, you're going to get certain types of information that always rise to the top in these systems. So for example, it might be information that is very controversial or very emotionally laden. And why is that? Because people naturally will click and engage with that content. And so you end up with an information ecosystem that sometimes can have people who are like rage baiters thrive in that system. And they didn't get designed for rage baiting, but in practice, of course, this was the word of the year actually, rage bait by the Oxford Dictionary. And that's because these systems are biased toward engagement, and you get all these side effects that come with the bias. And we'll talk about how that manifests in large language models and generative AI as well. But my general point is, all these systems are optimized for a very specific thing, and you need to think about what that is to understand how the output is extremely narrow sometimes toward that goal.
Mm-hmm. Tessa, are there any sort of illustrative examples of where people have noticed bias in AI, or that people talk about in social science?
Yeah, I think one of my favorite examples is actually in one of the most simple forms of AI, which is just automated translation. So if you go onto Google Translate, for instance, you're typing in, trying to order something at a French restaurant, let's say, Turkish restaurant. This is going to be my example. So if you go on there, and you can try this yourself. I tried it for myself yesterday, and it's still working. Still making errors, so my example is still working. If you type in, she is a doctor and he is a nurse. So you're intentionally reversing our typical social bias. And then you translate it to Turkish. You get back, o bir doktore, o bir hemşire. Apologies for the atrocious Turkish accent. That doesn't exist. Turkish is a unique language because it has this o pronoun, basically is a gender-neutral pronoun. You do that, great. It automatically translates he and she into this gender-neutral pronoun. Then you just flip that little button and see the reverse translation. And o bir doktore, even though you had intentionally put in she is a doctor, the reverse translation will automatically give you back he is a doctor. And this is this learned historical association that the model has in our language, where stereotypically and in the statistics, doctors are more likely to be men. The problem is it, even in Google Translate, isn't giving you a flag to say this is a form of bias or this is because of my historical training data. And yet it's going to, again, be giving you this kind of normative signal that doctor equals man.
Yes. So William, biases in technology, they didn't start with AI. You talked a little bit about studying in other systems. What is similar or different about bias in AI models relative to past technologies?
Yeah, well, also just to clarify, I think when we talk about artificial intelligence, we mean a broad term that refers to any system that is designed to learn like a human does. So you have some desired output, the model will learn on its own, so to speak, how to get that desired output without the human explicitly telling it what to do. So actually, when it comes to the algorithms used on social media platforms, I would actually consider that AI as well. But if what you mean is where do these biases emerge in generative AI, so again, taking this broader step back and thinking about what are large language models and generative AI systems optimized for? Well, they're actually optimized for a few specific things. One of them is to predict the most probabilistic outcome, okay? So that seems simple enough. It actually makes them work very well for lots of things. But one of the things that comes with is a bias toward the modal response, meaning something that is very average, right? So imagine you're in your job and you have to come up with new creative ideas. Well, maybe you should consider the fact that these models are actually designed to produce average output, right? Considering all the language they have available. Here's a really good example, and I want to give a shout out to our colleague, Brian Utsi, who did this really cool experiment in his MBA class recently. So The idea was he was giving students what's called a divergent aptitude test. So in this test, it's very simple. You have a few minutes to come up with 10 words, and the words have to be the most as different as possible, right? So you come up with one word, you need to come up with something that's way different. So you would think a large language model has access to all the words. It could do this extremely well. Well, it turns out humans do it better. So Tessa would know this, there's what, 50,000 words in the English language?
Way more.
Way more, okay.
Yeah,
So over 50,000 words. And what we're able to do is just think outside the box and come up with these really out there words. But what he found was the AI models were producing this very, very narrow range of words. And that's part of this bias I'm talking about. They are designed to predict the most likely next word. And so the range of what it comes up with for this creative task is going to be narrow. So being aware of these kinds of biases, I think is very important when you're thinking about how am I using AI and what task will it be best for, which we'll talk about later.
And I'm obligated to plug that we have a story about Brian Utzi's experiment on Insight right now. I'm sure my colleagues have already dropped it in the chat, but
Yes.
please do after the webinar, check that out, yes. Well, let's talk about how the bias gets into these AI models. And I think a lot of people are aware of this concept that large language models in particular are trained on data that has its own biases. So often they're trained on data from the internet, trained on history of books and magazine articles. How does this lead to bias in an AI model? And is this really the most important factor, or the one that people need to worry about?
Yeah.
Tessa, maybe start.
It's definitely the first factor that people should be thinking about. And it's definitely the first factor in kind of the AI life cycle. You mentioned a lot of the biases, it's dominated by certain kind of elite discourse. It's controlled by publishing houses. It's controlled by predominantly white, male publishing houses, especially when you think of the history that's baked into these training data. This is also, we should be clear, as Billy was saying, AI is this massive term, and we've been talking a lot about language-based AI, so like translations, algorithms on social media, but it also includes image data, right? Video data. Those also have these same kind of biases. So facial recognition software will be based on these same kinds of distributions that are predominantly centered around like a white man. All of those kinds of training data we should be aware of, we should be wary of. But there's way more kind of steps in the AI lifecycle beyond just that training data. So the next step, if you go to some of these generative AI models, you'll have annotators, people in Silicon Valley or now throughout the entire world who are checking the accuracy, essentially, of the outputs based on these training data. And they'll be giving little tweaks here and there and inputting their own human biases to say, oh, well, this is the wrong answer. This is the right answer. And you can imagine every time you put a human into the loop or into this AI lifecycle, you're going to have human biases. So them flagging what is a right or a wrong answer is going to be informed by their own biases. So we also have to think about the annotators, where they're located, what kind of assumptions they have coming into it.
Right. I imagine a related factor is that a lot of the big players in AI are American companies, English speakers, people from
Absolutely.
Western countries. So how does that kind of combine with this annotation step and maybe magnify bias that's already there?
Well, there's no doubt there's been plenty of studies, and actually Tessa knows these better than me, but you do see patterns of like Western thought come out in models when you're doing reasoning tasks and things like that. And I would just also emphasize that besides the language that the annotators are speaking, we've seen much broader biases come out from this kind of human feedback that is related to the engagement-based models that I'm talking about. But we might remember there was a big thing made out of one of the GPT models that was just telling everyone what they wanted to hear, right?
Yeah.
And that's actually because of the fact that they were relying heavily on human feedback, because what do we like? We like when the model tells us things that sound nice to us.
Yeah.
It turns out that that is problematic if we really care about accuracy or factual information. So Tessa, I think, can talk more about for example, cultural differences that get baked in depending on the annotator. But I would also say there's pan-cultural things that get baked in as annotators, right? So both of these things are at play.
Yeah, absolutely. We see a lot. I mean, we actually haven't done this in the social bias space, but we've done it in a related domain of looking at how different cultures think about nature, think about their environments, and whether there are certain kind of Western-centric biases that come in there. And in that data, we show that actually English is worse on this nature attitude than 71% of other languages around the world. So we're far, far behind. And if we think of the fact that now, I mean, Billy and I were just throwing out potential numbers like 90%, 97%, 99% now of English or of language on the internet is English. If we think of that and the fact that English is falling behind in terms of how it's thinking about nature, thinking about the environment, then we're in a bad place if that's the model that we're relying on to talk about these kinds of policies or talk about nature or talk about the environment.
Right, right. I want to go back to the model optimization point that you brought up. And you mentioned engagement as a target that these systems typically use. Are there other optimized things that models optimize for that could introduce different biases than the example you gave earlier?
Yeah, it really depends on the model, but I think the thing that thinking about what people use the most, engagement is one of the things that you see across lots of models that are consumer facing. And the reason is most of these companies have made a decision, how do I actually profit off of these AI systems? Well, it's actually social media solved this, and Google search has solved this. You increase your advertising revenue by keeping people on the platform, right? And so if the AI is optimized for that, then basically what we attend to, what we click on, what we share, those are all the things that are going to get amplified by the system. It's very interesting because generative AI is now facing a similar situation. Any reasonable expert has seen that we're in an AI bubble. Is it going to burst? We don't know, but it looks like it could. And so now they're in a situation where they have to decide, how am I going to profit off of this? And so it is interesting to think about, are they going to do the same thing social media did? And as someone who has studied how AI systems have contributed to political polarization and things of that nature over the past decade, I hope they think a little more carefully about that, because it's very complicated. And the one thing I also want to point out to your question, it is a choice. What do we optimize for? And maybe that's something we'll come back to later, but it isn't a given that if you optimize for engagement, you're actually going to increase long-term user retention. You will increase short-term user engagement. There's no doubt AI models are very good at this, but there's a lot of data suggesting, for example, this year was one of the first where social media use actually at a group level reduced in terms of all the different demographics. It's not that it is like at a low level, but it's just the first time since its advent that it went down. And I think one of the reasons is you log on to social media, especially some of these platforms, and you're like, I am tired of some of this stuff that I'm seeing, right? We've all had some experience. Yeah. Even if it's positive, I mean, you might go on LinkedIn and say, man, these colleagues are too positive for me. But yeah, so my point is, we need to start thinking, and again, we'll probably talk about this more later, what would we optimize for if we really want to have people enjoy the experience? I think that's something that companies need to take more seriously.
And we've talked a lot about things that the creators of the models do that introduce bias, however inadvertently. Is there any burden on the users of AI, like the types of models that people gravitate towards, or how much they trust them, or what things they use AI for that then feeds back to introduce or amplify bias in these systems?
Yeah, there's probably 2 points there, and Billy can take one. I know we've talked about this a lot. So one is, which kinds of models do people choose more likely, or which ones would they want? And we have just one study on this. It's earlier data, but when we've given people an option between what we'd call kind of an accurate model, it's presenting the world as it is, it's telling you things like, stereotypically and statistically, women are more likely to be nurses, men are more likely to be doctors. Would you prefer that model, or would you prefer a model that maybe explicitly challenges your stereotypes and actually starts showing you pictures of women who are doctors and men who are nurses, for instance? Or would you like a model that actually amplifies these stereotypes, shows you just men who are doctors and just men who are nurses? Overwhelmingly, people pick the accurate model, then the amplifying model, and lastly, the challenging stereotype model. And so if we had, that's the saddest news as someone who tries to study interventions that predominantly focus on challenging people's stereotypes. That seems to be a path that we can't take, in that people would not want to invest in those models. They would not want to purchase those models, for instance. And so we have to think about maybe other kinds of tools to intervene on those biases beyond just choices. So as a consumer, being aware of maybe you do want to try and think about ways that you could increase your trust or increase your interest in these challenging models. Yeah.
And what was the second point that doesn't mention? Do you know?
Yeah, I'm not fully sure, but I will make a broader point, which is that one way as consumers we can, mitigate some of these biases. We've been talking about just becoming aware of them, right? And so thinking about how do you responsibly, maybe that's not the right word, how do you, in the best way, use AI for your goals, right? And so I think I gave the example earlier of this creative problem-solving task. If you're in a situation where you need to make some decisions that require creative thinking, require diverse perspectives, you shouldn't assume that you can just have AI generate the whole thing, which, the models are being sold as being able to do that, right? So you wouldn't be, the first person to try that. But understanding some of the biases, like I talked about, the mode or the average effect, understanding what Tessa's been talking about, how you can't just say, hey, pretend you are an X type of person. The model is just going to draw from the stereotypes, right? So there really is, in my opinion, the best way to use AI as a consumer, as a user, is to use it as a collaborator. Have the human creativity, have your colleagues, have the diverse perspectives. There's no substitute for that. But use it to kind of amplify how you all are thinking. So you're generating the ideas, but AI is maybe giving you some feedback or going off of what you said. Notice how that's different than, please help me solve this problem, and pretend you are we were talking about the example of a gay conservative or something like, just making up some category of someone you don't know, right?
Right. So I want to back up, now that we've listed sort of many places bias can arise, and ask a devil's advocate question, which is, why should we care? And for starters, I want to define we as sort of the casual user of AI, somebody who just dabbles in it, uses it maybe to write some emails, maybe research a topic or ask for advice. Why should that person be aware of bias, or what should they be concerned about with the bias in what they receive back from these AI tools?
Again, if we go back to our definition from step one of what a bias is, right? It's a deviation from either accuracy or from our values. And I think both of those give us reason to care. If you're worried about this model showing you something that is just, the very center of that distribution and not telling you about the nuances, then it's inaccurate. And so to Billy's point too about creativity, it's not going to give you high quality information that you might want to use or might want to defend. So that's definitely one reason to care. You might be propelling factual incorrections, But then the other one of, this is different from your values. We know that the vast majority of Americans want an egalitarian society. They have egalitarian values. They explicitly endorse egalitarianism, even now, despite that New York Times opinion. They still want it explicitly, right? So given all of these levels of AI bias that we're talking about, using AI in that way that maybe you're unaware of the degree of bias is a deviation from your own values, unless you're constantly checking it and auditing it yourself and making sure that you're not allowing those biases from AI to infiltrate into your decisions. So care about it, because it could be inaccurate and it could also be giving you information that's not in line with your values.
And these are sort of individual effects of bias, but obviously those things aggregate as more and more people are using AI, and these same things are repeating themselves. So what's sort of, I guess, societal level concerns about the bias in personal use, let's say, as opposed to business use?
Yeah, so there's a lot of really interesting cases. I mean, when you get to the societal level, I can talk a little bit about some of my data with AI systems used on social media, but there's also lots of things I think we're just starting to see with the use of generative AI, and so I can talk a little bit about that. But first of all, we've seen, I think, the direction. Let's just talk about politics, because that's what I've studied a lot in my research. Two things that we've seen. One, we've seen the rise of polarization. We're at all-time highs in terms of how much each political group dislikes one another. So you can argue about whether or not policy-wise we actually disagree as much as we do, but the facts are in, we hate each other, and it's worse than it has been in the past, right? So, excuse me, where does that come from? It's coming from a lot of different things, a lot of cultural things, a lot of historical things, but what I show in my research is that these AI systems that are amplifying content based on engagement, they play at least some role in that. And so what we see, for example, is that you can track the rise of moral outrage online in U.S. politics and misinformation that uses moral outrage to spread widely. These things are systematically amplified by engagement-based algorithms or these AI systems that control what we see on social media. So you might have started with this very simple decision, hey, let's optimize for engagement because that's going to increase my advertising revenue. That seems completely reasonable. But one of the things we're starting to notice is that when you get a bunch of people using these platforms and human biases start to interact with them, you get these things like the rise of polarization, rage baiting as an industry, all these kind of things that the average person just reflects for a second and says, that doesn't seem like the best thing for our society. And I think when we start to pivot to generative AI now, there's an interesting case where we're seeing a lot of things getting optimized for this averageness, right? And so if you're constantly producing content that is average, you might be able to draw a lot of people out. This is maybe going down a slightly different topic, but we're starting to see evidence of this in our culture. Every movie we've seen recently is a remake. All the music is recycling stuff from previous generations. And AI systems play a role in that because they're predicting, hey, what is the thing that people is easiest to predict that people will like? You just recycle stuff from the past and take the average. And so perhaps if you care about innovation, if you care about being someone who can step outside the box and predict what is next in the industry, use AI carefully. Use it to amplify your own creative ideas. Don't use it to just say, hey, tell me what's next. AI simply, we have evidence that it's not good for that sort of thing.
I also want to add one more thing that Billy's research speaks beautifully to, which is how norms form in online communities, but also in our society. And one of the ways as humans that we create norms or we create patterns of behavior is we look around and see what other people are doing. And when you go on social media and you see tons of rage, you see tons of outrage, you will also start to conform to that. And it creates this kind of divorcing of what you're doing online and what these algorithms are amplifying from what people actually want and what the reality is. AI adds into that because we think AI is objective reality, right? We have this, varies a little bit by groups. Women are less likely to trust AI than men are, for instance. But in general, we have a large degree of trust and perceived objectivity in AI. And so when you think of this objective or seemingly objective signal of AI and this kind of new norm that it's creating, that can create a pretty toxic culture that we think we need to conform to. So at the societal level, those kinds of new norms of, it's giving me these stereotypes of men and women or gay and straight people or black and white people, and that's objective, I guess. Could people then start conforming to those stereotypes and think that that's the way they should be as well?
And so feeding back on public opinion. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
I want to talk about from a business perspective. A lot of our audience comes from the business community. Obviously, businesses are racing to incorporate AI tools every level of their operations. What do businesses need to be aware of as far as the risks of bias in AI tools that they're rushing into? Either of you can take this one.
Yeah, I think just to reiterate a lot of what we've been saying specifically with generative AI, I think at the individual level, the most common use that I see, I can think about my own use even, is you're using it for little things like, hey, help edit this email, or help me come up with this idea, or help me solve this decision. What we've been talking about is if you're aware of the biases that AI has baked into the systems, you know when it's a good use case for it and when it's not. And so we've been talking about, for example, decision-making, creative processes. Use it as a collaborator. Don't use it as the pure generator, right? So these things are pretty straightforward, I think, when it comes to how do you want to increase your productivity. use it in a way that amplifies your existing ideas, like as a collaborator.
I would also add, like, some of the most famous failures of AI early on, especially, were in hiring scenarios.
Yes.
So resume screening, for instance, because again, it's optimized on these historical patterns in the data. And so Amazon had this really famous failure of AI hiring where they were using it to screen resumes, and they had historically omitted a lot of women because women were not good at computer programming, they were not good at these kinds of things historically. And so they were just automatically screening all those resumes out. And this went on for like 3 years. Like, it was from 2013, I think they scrapped it in 2017. So that is definitely something to be aware of. If you haven't already audited your hiring practices and you don't actually know what the historical data is in your company, and then you implement an AI assistant on top of that hiring, it's likely that it's not only just going to replicate those biases, but it could even amplify them. Because again, it's trying to optimize, it's trying to find normative patterns.
Well, I think we're all sufficiently spooked now, probably a lot of our viewers are as well, about bias in AI, but half of our title was what we can do about it. So I want to stick with the business example first. What can businesses do? They might say, okay, we recognize that there's bias in these tools, but not using those tools is not an option anymore. Everybody's rushing to use them. So maybe Tessa, I'll go back to you. What do businesses do to make sure that the tools are being used and that they're minimizing the harm from the bias?
So oftentimes when you're implementing an AI tool, you're implementing something off the shelf. Right? So as researchers, we often are worried about those off the shelf, like how do we reduce bias in GPT and in the actual model itself? That we'll set aside for later, like how do we get it out at the root. But if you're just taking an off-the-shelf model and implementing it on top of your own data, then you're doing something that's basically called fine-tuning, where you're taking your additional data and you're telling the model to, again, optimize on top of that. So as I was mentioning, you need to audit that data. You need to know what are you telling it to feed into. And if you've noticed that you've had, say, historical biases in hiring, maybe you could intentionally try and upweight some of those examples of like women as computer programmers or women as managers or leaders so that you have these counterexamples and use those as fine-tuning. I would also say probably the biggest thing though, even aside from just the fine-tuning and the training data intervention, would be the consumption, like information about, this is what we keep talking about, of where is it helpful and where could it just be blatant harm and actually cause more difficulties than it's worth, right? And maybe hiring is one of those cases. So really auditing also which tasks you're implementing AI in would be a great tool or a great strategy.
Okay. If I'm a business leader, I might think, this sounds like a lot of work. Why can't AI companies just give me a bias-free model? Why can't they build a better model? And the non-technical thing I think maybe I would go to is, why can't they just find training data that doesn't have bias in it? Why is that more difficult than it sounds, and why it might not even fix all the problems?
Yeah, I can say a few things. Tessa, again, is the leading expert here. But here's one thing that we know. If you try to get more representative data, it can help somewhat. But the problem is there just are statistical regularities in data. Certain classes or social groups are not represented as much because of things we've talked about, like who's doing the publishing, et cetera. And that is just going to be a problem no matter how much data you get. Okay, so that's one thing. And if you ask a model to try to simulate that, again, they're just going to come up with like stereotypes. Mm-hmm. The other thing I would mention, which we haven't quite talked about yet, is that these models are constantly training on data. Some of that is starting to be AI-produced data. And by the way, it's really hard, nearly impossible to detect some of these, whether it's human AI or somewhere in between. Now, the reason why this is a very important problem is because of something called model collapse. So this is the idea that once AI models start to get fed their own output, they start to become increasingly inaccurate because basically now they're getting trained on not a true representation of the world, but actually the biased output that comes from their biased models, right? And so it's something that I think companies are generally aware of, but I think it's a bigger problem than we're talking about right now, something to keep in mind in the future.
Mm-hmm. I would say, echoing much of what Billy said, in some senses for these massive models like GPT, they have so much training data. They have so many, billions of parameters, which means all the kind of like knobs and whistles that they're adding to make these models really good. That in some senses, the horse has kind of left the stable on the training data point. And again, it comes to later checks and balances that we can think about for intervening for these companies. Because also, again, the vast majority of these companies are for-profit companies. So it's not necessarily in their interest to go back, especially when you think of that example I gave of most people just want accuracy. They're actually not that interested in challenging their biases. Given that, the kind of bottom line that most of these companies are seeing is not in doing the super labor-intensive act of retraining their models and making them unbiased from the ground up. They're going to look to just adding on layers and checks and balances later, which could be, and again, the data is still kind of out on this. We don't have tons of good evidence of where debiasing is actually going to work. So it's possible that some of those later checks and balances could work. It just right now, we haven't seen good evidence that we've been able to fully debias that base model.
Yeah, one thing related to that I've seen, the argument from some AI model creators is that transparency will solve some of these problems. If we can train the models, or if we have the models explain how they arrived at their conclusion or their answer, then that will sort of surface awareness of potential biases. Do you buy that, or do you think that's a solution?
I buy the idea that it could help educate people somewhat insofar as they care about the biases that are going into data or the reasoning. I do buy that. The only issue is there's evidence coming out now, so there's like kind of this meta science about how AI models reason. And there's evidence that the reasoning itself is biased in several different ways, which is a whole other conversation. And so I think it can help. Transparency is important for lots of reasons, just helping people understand. Let's look at the case of social media. Why am I getting this recommendation? Or in generative AI, where is this idea coming from? What was your reasoning process? I think that's generally good, and I'm totally on board with that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It can also help, like there's one great paper from one of our colleagues down at UChicago on whether transparent models or proprietary models, so that's like ChatGPT and those kinds of things, whether these more transparent models have more or less biases. And in general, these transparent models, they still have bias, but because of the transparency, you can see where it's happening. And so again, it just comes back to that information. And I know that she's working on questions of whether there's possibility of intervening like just exactly on those layers where bias first arises. And perhaps you could make a better business case that way, because you could say you don't have to go from ground up and redo everything, but because we can identify exactly which layers in that transparent training process is bias first infiltrating, then maybe it's a more efficient way of debiasing.
Mm-hmm. How about disclaimers? You mentioned earlier in your "she is a doctor" example that sometimes they'll run like a little disclaimer. This information may be biased. Beware. Yeah. Do those work, or are they kind of like a new version of the privacy policy that nobody reads on software?
I think it's a great empirical question. I'm actually not aware of any research that's looked into people's attention to those disclaimers. One thing I will say is, because I was curious about this yesterday, and I did the translation in Google Translate, and then I went to ChatGPT and I did the translation in ChatGPT, and ChatGPT gives you those disclaimers, and it actually gives you the answer of he, she is a doctor, he, she is a nurse, and tells you the whole thing about its own training biases and all those kinds of things. So I think disclaimers might be helpful when we're thinking about generative AI. It's going to give you a very labor-intensive explanation. It's unlikely when you think of how most people are using AI without even realizing it in things like automated translation through Google Translate, right? It's unlikely that, again, there's a business case there for adding this labor-intensive explanation. When people are using simple AI, they want a simple answer. And so it's unlikely that those disclaimers there are going to be implemented or useful.
Mm-hmm. William, you mentioned when we were talking about other optimization targets, you had mentioned before the hour today this idea of value-aligned models as a potential alternative. Can you explain what those are and how they work and how they fight against bias?
Yeah, so this is something I'm studying in my research, and there's a few approaches to this idea of value-aligned artificial intelligence. So one of them is, why don't we just ask people what they want and have AI systems that are optimized for people's, explicit voting or what they report liking. So there's some issues with that depending on what the use case is. But something that I've also studied is thinking about, rather than optimizing for things like engagement or the most probabilistic output, we could think about trying to optimize for something that I call social representativeness. And this is the idea that we should try to, for example, in a social media environment, don't just represent the rare rage baiters who draw in all the attention. Try to have a more diverse set of data that you're representing in the systems, and that creates a more realistic understanding of like what others think. Or in the case of generative AI, you could do something similar where you're thinking about not just the mode, but the whole distribution of ideas. Say if you're asking it about, hey, explain to me, what does the average American think about XYZ? Because I want to learn about political attitudes or something like that. So we're testing this out. And in fact, what we see so far, I did a big study in the 2024 US presidential election. And so we designed an algorithm that tried to reduce the influence of extreme political users. And so what we found, and this is my case for any companies who want to try this out, is that users reported in our representative algorithm that they enjoyed their experience more in the 2 months that they were on the platform. So they, in the short term, engaged slightly more with the traditional engagement-based algorithm, but over the course of the study, they reported that they'd be more likely to use in the future the representative algorithm. So again, going back to this distinction, optimization for short-term outcomes or optimization for long-term user retention. I think this is a really important thing for companies to consider.
Well, call me cynical. Some of these sound like great solutions, but I'm not sure companies are going to do them on their own. So then there's the idea of AI regulation. Maybe not in the US in the current landscape. There seems to be a big push against it, but other countries are looking at this. What does regulation look like that could limit bias? And what are the pros and cons of that approach?
So I think that there's something to be said about regulation just around transparency, for sure. And the EU has definitely done this in many other ways as well. So having these companies have to report, for instance, on their training data, on their models, all of these kinds of things. So I think we could definitely regulate more to get us more towards those transparent models, which, as we said, could be part of the solution. I do think some of that pushback, maybe Billy can address too, some of that pushback is about this idea that regulation will inevitably harm innovation. But as Billy was saying, also without regulation, AI could harm innovation. So it's not, I think the pushback, we have to be aware of where that's coming from and also address that.
Yeah, that's right. I think in general, transparency is kind of the bare minimum. But you know, when these AI companies like OpenAI first came out, one of the guiding principles was an idea of AI safety, which is generally a term that describes, hey, we're going to study the potential negative impacts that bias in our models could have, or all different kinds of harms that could come out. What we're seeing just empirically is that companies are not putting that as forefront anymore because they want to, be the top company or whatever that means. But look, we're in a situation, like I said, that is very similar to social media was in the early 2010s. And these decisions now are going to determine what the future of AI looks like in the US, for example. And I think the idea of just like putting AI safety in the background is going to have negative consequences. And I don't think it's in the long run, if we really want to innovate in a safe way that's going to have a good product for consumers, we definitely need regulation with companies working within those bounds, right? Because if we don't have that, we see what's happening right now.
We're getting a lot of great audience questions. I'm going to jettison the rest of mine and move into some of these. And this one is actually good because we didn't really talk about the potential for positive biases. And the question, I'll read it, is, in instances where bias is actually good, for example, in vacation travel preferences, how do we retain these positive biases in AI systems? So maybe you can broaden it to, are there positive biases that pop up in these systems?
Yeah, so as Billy was saying too earlier, most of my research is focused on these biases that are about socio-demographic groups. And in that case, it's pretty rare to find a positive bias. Although some models actually are pro-gay, for instance, which, again, this is a debate of, do we want a model that is prioritizing one group over another, even if it's towards the minority group, which, liberals amongst us might say things like, that's great, that's exactly where we want to go. We want a pro-gay, pro-black kind of model. I would say what you want is a model that gives you information from both sides of the spectrum, right? It gives you information that is representing these two groups in ways that match their statistics, but maybe also tells you these statistics have all this historical baggage, they have all this historical data. So they give you a lot more nuance than either going one direction and saying, well, this is a positive bias, or going in our typical direction and saying that this is a negative bias. So I think that's to address the elephant in the room of like sociodemographic biases. In terms of the audience members' particular question about travel preferences, for instance, it's a really interesting question, actually, because I think even there you might be wary of this kind of normative pressure or this kind of modal response, where it kind of depends on what you mean by a good bias for a travel preference. Like, do you want to go to Hawaii and Mexico with everyone else, or do you want to get these kind of innovative travel alternatives and go to Nicaragua or, Cuba or something like that as an alternative? And so even there, you want to be aware of what it means when you just get a modal response, where there might still be these biases, even for seemingly innocuous questions. Mm-hmm. And it could also do things, even when you're asking things like, what route should I take to go to Mexico, or where should I go in Mexico? It's going to also have stereotypes baked in about what it sees as a criminal neighborhood, what it sees as a poor neighborhood. It's going to tell you not to go to those places, which again, could be information that you want to weigh, but you should always weigh it with a kind of filter of where those historical biases are coming from.
Mm-hmm. I would just add something. I really like this question because it brings up also to me the idea of user choice. And so I think what they're probably talking about is like, hey, I have an hour in Mexico City. What's the most popular thing? Well, actually, the mean response would be great for that, right?
Yeah.
And so I think this idea of user choice where you could, and this is something I'm studying, if you build this into AI where you say, hey, I would actually like in this case for you to have this kind of modal kind of response, but in other cases, I would like you to be more creative. Now, you can try to do that with prompts, but as we were talking about, it has severe limits right now. But in the future, perhaps AI systems could be built that actually give a user the choice to kind of tap into a certain bias in a positive way. Now, that has lots of potential dangers, but in this case, I think it could work.
Mm-hmm. Another use case we've gotten a couple questions about is healthcare, and I know a lot of AI models are pushing into this. So one person asks, can you share examples of bias that a healthcare patient should keep in mind if they are using AI to support their health?
Ooh, that's interesting. I think we have an excellent colleague who could give you an answer on this. Matt Groh has research in the healthcare AI collaboration space. Mm-hmm. As a healthcare patient, I think one of the things I would be most wary of is how your data is being used by these AI systems or by your doctors as well. So there's, again, famous failures of healthcare systems overusing AI to misdiagnose any patient that has less data, right? So women, for instance, with heart attacks and stroke, or Black patients with some kinds of chronic pain, there is less data on that, not because they're less likely to have those conditions, but because the historical data has meant they're less likely to access treatment. Mm-hmm. And so being aware of where do I fall in these demographic patterns, and therefore what kind of biases are likely to be there because of history. How should I be aware of doctors potentially making decisions because they're using AI to inform their treatment of me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and another thing I thought of is funny. I'm actually dealing with this right now with pet insurance. My dog is elderly, and so we have this claim that was randomly rejected. I'm also a negotiations professor, by the way, so this is relevant. But one of the things that I would recommend as a consumer and a user of healthcare is sometimes you get, for example, a claim rejected, and you're like, that doesn't make sense because it previously was not. Probably what happened is they have an AI system, something got flagged for whatever reason. So you can. What I did in this case is I called them up and I said, hey, can you give me a full, transparent explanation? Why was this claim denied? And ultimately, for me, that ended up working because they were saying, oh, well, maybe it was a mistake, and they looked into it, and we ended up getting the claim covered in the end. So demand, certain things from these companies using AI, like something basic as tell me, why did this happen? Give me the full explanation. Just some practical advice that could help. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
An interesting question about, and I think it speaks to the broader topic of AI literacy, but when people are writing prompts, when they're asking questions of AI, are there ways to keep bias out of your question? I've seen examples of you ask the same model, the same question with slightly different wording, gives you very different answers. So is there room for education in this space?
Absolutely. I think you can you can definitely prompt your way towards a less biased response, or at least towards a response that might give you two sides of a perspective, right? So you could ask, make sure that you're not using sociodemographic information to inform your response, or give me a response that is counter-stereotypical or that challenges my stereotypes. And so you're going to get out a response that includes that information. And that's great because, again, it could start to reinforce, oh, wow, yeah, you're right. When you give me an example of a man who's a nurse, I'm like, oh, yeah, I can see how that would start to challenge my stereotype. But again, the prompts are only happening at the very, very end of these models. And so even when you're telling it to do things like be counter-stereotypical or don't use demographic information or give me the liberal and the conservative opinion of this piece, even then, it's going to have, from the ground up, some biases baked in. So just being aware and being, even then, still a critical consumer of whatever you get, because there could be, especially these kinds of implicit biases in the words that you're getting back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to add on some very specific practical advice for using prompts, there's two main things that the data show can improve the output of AI. Again, as Tessa mentioned, these have some limits, but one would be tell the AI system to take on the role of whatever is relevant for you. So say you are interested in like math problems, say you are a mathematician, blah, blah, blah. And then the other thing is to give concrete examples. There's a whole set of research on this. AI responds very well to that by kind of constraining the output by giving it examples and telling it that it is a certain type of model or person.
Mm-hmm. Great. Have either of you ever just asked these models, are you biased? What did they say when you prompt them?
I have. I did it actually when the very first ChatGPT models came out. And so that was still at a time, actually, early on, the ChatGPT model did have some transparency metrics. So you could actually toggle things like the temperature of the model, which gives you like the determinism of the model. You could also toggle whether you wanted a really old model version or a newer model version, for instance. And so I would ask it at these various model stages, are you biased? Tell me about yourself. And especially the more complex models would give me pretty elaborate answers about how they're trained on these bias data. They bake in historical statistics, and that helps them optimize, but it also means that it introduces error, all those kinds of things. The most simple models, funnily enough, would say things like, I am a white male, hence I have bias. So it was, the simple models have some self-awareness even, but I think even now when we get to these more sophisticated models, you do get a lot of disclaimers when you're using ChatGPT, a lot of information about how these models are thinking about themselves, or aware of their biases, aware as much as a model can be, aware of their biases. It's just still not enough.
Mm-hmm. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. We have many more questions we could address, but I think we have done a great job of handling this very important topic. And thank you, Tessa, and thank you, William, for joining us today. And thank you to our viewers for joining us and for sending in such great questions. I'm sorry we didn't have time to get to all of them. Just a reminder again that our next webinar will be about a month from now, February 26th, with Lee Thompson on Can Business Negotiation Strategies Work with Friends and Family. I think AI might come up in that one as well, so stay tuned for that. We'll be sending out an email soon with a link to register, so your best bet is to sign up for the Kellogg Insight newsletter and hear about that and all of our future events. So thank you all for attending, and we'll see you next time.